Welcome to lesson 9.2, where we will be talking about the law of cosines. Now, the law of cosines does kind of work with the law of sines, and there are some little tricks to it that we need to know. So we're going to go through this very carefully. To start out with, if you remember, last lesson for 9.1, we talked about what we need to know in order to do the law of sines. So for the law of sines, we need to know one complete pair. That was the whole key to it. Well, the law of cosines actually has two options. For the law of cosines, you either need to know all three sides, which we call SSS, because that's all three sides, or you need to know two sides and the angle between them. And we call that SAS, because we have two sides and the angle between them. Those are the two cases where you use the law of cosines, and you can see those examples on the next page. So this one has two sides and the angle between those two sides. So that's a law of cosines. This one has all three sides, so that's a law of cosines. If it doesn't fit those two, then it has to be law of sines. Now let's talk about these. These are the three different versions of the law of cosines. We need to know all of them. But there's a trick instead of just blunt memorizing this. There are actually 4 patterns in these equations that we can use instead. So let's talk about these patterns. First off, you may notice that whatever letter you start with is the same letter that you end with, except the one at the end is a capital, an angle, as we learned last time. Capitals are always angles. Whatever you start with is what you end with. Second pattern. You may notice that all of these have a -2, and they all have a cosine, because this is the law of cosines. There's always a -2 and a cosine. Next, if you look at the letter we start with and compare it to the letters that come after it, you may notice that whatever you start with, the other two are what come next. So if I start with A, the next two are B and C. If I start with B, the next two are A and C. If I start with C, the next two are A and B. And they're always squared and added. Kind of like your Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. So whatever you start with, the next two things are the other letters squared and added. Okay, last pattern. You may notice that the two letters that are here, it's the same two letters repeated. So if this is A squared and C squared, then after my -2, I do A and C. Repeat the squared added numbers after the -2. That is our law of cosines. And if you can remember those patterns, it's way easier to memorize these. So for example, let's go to the top of the next page. Let's say I want to solve for b squared. Well, let's use our patterns. The next things that would come would be the other two letters squared and added. So a squared and c squared. Next always comes a minus 2. Then I repeat those two letters, so a and c. And then I have cosine of the letter I started with, so capital B. And then that way, as long as you know whatever letter you start with, you can finish out the whole thing. And you'll see as we do the law of cosines that you will always know what letter you start with. So in the next video, we'll go through and actually start with example number 1 and talk about how to apply the law of cosines.